Well, first to Syria and the airstrikes launched by the US, Britain, and France to punish the Assad regime for its alleged use of chemical weapons. They came weeks after President Trump says he wants the US military out of Syria entirely. Now, at the moment, there are about 2,000 US troops there. So, was the latest mission justified? Was it accomplished, as President Trump boasts? And what's the end game? What do the US and its allies hope to achieve? Jeffrey Sachs is a world-renowned professor of economics and a leading voice against US involvement in Syria. He was a foreign policy advisor to the Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. He's the director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University in New York and a director of the UN Millennium Project. Jeffrey, welcome to ABC Radio.
Wonderful to be with you. Thank you.
Was this US-led missile strike in Syria, this is the second in a year, was it justified?
Well, the whole war, of course, is a disaster, and the U.S. has played a major role in causing the war and causing the disaster. So we're going to have continued crises until we stop what we're doing in the U.S., get out of Syria, end this war. So this is the perspective that we need to start with.
But isn't it worth punishing a regime for using these dreadful chemical weapons? Let me just run a quote by you. It's Sir Max Hastings. He's the distinguished British military historian. Quote, "To sustain civilised societies, we must preserve an international order with some obedience to rules, including those that ban chemical weapons." That's Max Hastings. He's reflecting the conventional wisdom. Your response?
We do need to preserve an international order. I have absolutely no desire in any way to be misunderstood as saying that use of chemical weapons is at all tolerable. I note that in any event, there should have been a proper independent investigation, as was about to happen. But the U.S., as usual, just went ahead and bombed. But if we're talking about international order, I couldn't agree more. But the first rule of international order is stop aggression against other countries. The United States has launched more wars against international law than any other country in modern history. It has sent the CIA into Syria to covertly try to overthrow the government. The U.S. launched wars, of course, in Iraq in March 2003, in Libya in 2011, in Syria. It has made such a mess.
We've had in this country in the last week Kenneth Roth, who's head of Human Rights Watch, and he has pointed out to these pictures of Syrian children, other civilians being killed, and he highlights the brutal role of Assad here. Remember, his security forces have maintained jails where torture is common. He's regularly bombed his own people, barrel bombs, cluster bombs, all that. And he's starved recalcitrant cities and regions into submission. Doesn't America and the civilized world have a right to stop this bloodshed?
The way that this war came about was that in early 2011, when the Arab Spring was starting, a number of countries in the region thought it would be convenient to throw Assad overboard. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, with U.S. very active diplomatic support, started to support a rebellion to overthrow Assad. Erdogan gave sanctuary to rebels. Jihadists flowed into Syria backed by Gulf money. We know that President Obama ordered the CIA secretly in an operation called Timber Sycamore to work with Saudi Arabia to overthrow Assad. And so we have a kind of attitude which is always to point out what the other side is doing, never to take into account what we ourselves are doing. And I always like to quote Jesus in terms of foreign policy when he said, "Why do you note the mote in the other's eye when you don't note the beam in your own eye?" It's a matter of understanding the context.
You quote Jesus. Let me quote James Baker. He's the President Bush Sr.'s Secretary of State in the early 90s. Now, he once said that the United States did not have a dog in the fight in the Yugoslavia Civil War in 91, 92. So given the morally ambiguous nature of this conflict that you've highlighted, does America have a dog in this fight in Syria's civil war?
No. we have made the fight. We have lots of allies that are fighting in Syria, not because they give a damn about Syria or about the humanitarian issues. I can assure you, they are fighting a proxy war. The United States is fighting Russia. The Saudis are fighting Iran. And the Syrians are the ones that have been killed, driven from their homes. It's so cynical. Let me give you a measure of how cynical this is. I'm going to read you the editorial yesterday from the Wall Street Journal, owned by that despicable man that you people know about well, Murdoch, who runs despicable propaganda outlets. But let me read what the Wall Street Journal said. Listen to this. The better U.S. strategy is to support regional opponents of Iranian imperialism and try to turn Syria into the Ayatollah's Vietnam. Only when Russia and Iran begin to pay a larger price in Syria will they have any incentive to negotiate an end to the war or even contemplate a peace based on dividing the country into ethnic-based enclaves. Now, does that sound like a humanitarian response, or does it sound like a completely despicable proxy war by these vain neoconservatives that have launched...
Well, to be fair, though, Jeffrey, it's not just the Wall Street Journal editorial page. It's the New York Times, the Washington Post, the CNN. It seems to me that the overwhelming conventional wisdom in the media, not just in the United States, but in Britain and Australia, they'll say similar things.
You're right. That's really the truth, by the way. There is so much propaganda. Interestingly, the Washington Post, which is exactly in the same situation, ran articles in the past couple of weeks saying, of course, we have to punish Assad, without mentioning anything about the U.S. violation of international law for 7 years. So I sent them a draft op-ed piece saying, by the way, why don't we look at the U.S. role in this? Their answer, well, not interested.
Now, if you just tuned in, you're on RN. I'm Tom Switzer, and I'm with the world-renowned professor of economics, Jeffrey Sachs. We're talking about Syria and the latest Western military strikes. Jeffrey, in some respects, you sound a little bit like Donald Trump in 2016. Now, he's now embracing a policy of Cold War confrontation with Russia and US war with Syria. But in 2016, he campaigned against both. How do you account for his mixed messaging?
Well, it's interesting. Even 2 weeks ago, he said, let's get out of Syria. And all of a sudden, all of this mainstream media said, no, you don't understand. You can't get out of Syria. Our security state is always revved for war. This is important for people to understand. We have a Pentagon that spends gobs more than all of the rest of the countries in the top 10. And so the job of the president is keep your foot on the brake all the time. Because the moment you lift your foot from the brake, the engine shoots the whole apparatus forward. And Obama was pretty good at keeping his foot on the brake, except he lifted it up, and there we were, CIA in Syria. He lifted it up, there we were in Libya. We know from inside accounts he was wringing his hands about that because he's a decent fellow, but he allowed these two wars. And here is Trump saying, let's get out. His instinct is actually right on this. I'm no fan, by the way, of the president.
Well, in some respects, he represents one side of the same coin that Bernie Sanders represents, appealing to a war-weary people, suffering from foreign policy fatigue since all those wars since 9/11. I suppose the question here is, what do you think he'll do now? Because he's also keen about deterring Iran's ambitions to dominate the Middle East, right?
Well, that's where he's torn, which is that we have this idée fixe in the United States about Iran. It almost literally goes back to the trauma of the hostage-taking in 1979. So the idea that Iran is the mortal enemy is constantly pounded in. Israel constantly pounds that in. Saudi Arabia pounds that in because of the Shia-Sunni divide. And so there's this revving for war. But Trump's instinct has been also get us out of this. And interestingly, Nikki Haley, the hardline ambassador of the U.S. to the UN, announced on the weekend that there'd be new sanctions against Russia. And then Trump said, not so fast.
That's right. He does seem to contradict his advisors, but he himself is all over the place.
He's all over the place, but the mainstream is only in one place, which is towards the military. But it was also more or less Obama's instinct to get out of Afghanistan. But he was told, no, you must never get out. You know, once the U.S. military's in, they want military bases. They want a base in Syria now. And why did Nikki Haley say we need a base in Syria? So we could, quote, watch Iran. And the Wall Street Journal explains, why do we need to be in Syria? Because then we have to protect the southern flank of NATO. Well, when you're all over the world, everyone is threatening you wherever you aren't. So you have this complete determination to put your pieces on the board everywhere.
Professor Jeffrey Sachs was a foreign policy advisor to Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. He's also a UN advisor and director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University.
This is Between the Lines with Tom Switzer.